The flames climbed higher than any man could reach, twisting against the black Virginia sky like serpents made of pure light. Jacob Harris stood at the edge of the forest, his hands still smelling of lamp oil and sulfur, watching the tobacco barns collapse one after another in cascades of orange and crimson. The heat pushed against his face even from 200 yards away, and he could hear the shouts of men waking to discover their entire harvest, their entire fortune turning to ash and smoke. He had maybe an hour before the dogs came, maybe less, but for these precious moments he allowed himself to witness what he had done. The fields glowed red for miles around, visible from neighboring plantations, visible perhaps all the way to Richmond. And Jacob thought of his mother's words about how sometimes a man has to burn down the world that enslaves him before he can walk free in a new one. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Jacob Harris had been born into chains in 1802 on the Marlowe plantation in Henrico County, Virginia. Delivered by his mother Dina in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, into a world where his value was calculated before he drew his first breath. His mother had been purchased at auction in 1798 for $600, and she told him this fact without emotion when he was old enough to understand numbers, along with the knowledge that he himself had been appraised at $50 when he was 3 years old, at $120 when he was 7, and at $400 when he turned 12 and his shoulders had broadened enough to handle full field work. She spoke these figures not to wound him but to educate him, because Dina believed that a slave who understood the mathematics of his bondage stood a better chance of calculating his way out of it. The Marlowe plantation sprawled across 800 acres of Virginia soil, and tobacco was its beating heart, the crop that determined whether the family ate well or poorly, whether new slaves were purchased or old ones sold off, whether Master Cornelius Marlowe walked with his head high in Richmond society or avoided his creditors on side streets. Jacob grew up among the tobacco from the time he could walk, first carrying water to the field hands, then pulling worms from the broad green leaves, then topping the plants when they flowered so the nutrients would flow into the leaves rather than seeds, and finally cutting and hanging the mature plants in the curing barns where they would dry for weeks until the leaves turned golden brown and filled the air with their sharp, earthy scent. He learned early that tobacco was a jealous master, demanding attention from March when the seeds were planted in carefully tended beds, through April when the seedlings were transplanted to the fields, through the long summer months of weeding and worming and topping, through the harvest in late August and September, and finally through the curing and stripping and packing that lasted into November. There was no season when tobacco released its grip on the plantation, no month when its demands did not shape every hour of every day for the 47 enslaved people who worked the Marlowe land. Jacob's hands bore permanent stains from the nicotine in the leaves, yellow-brown marks that no amount of washing could remove, and his back carried scars from the time he had dropped an armful of cut tobacco in the mud and Master Cornelius had ordered 15 lashes to teach him the value of careful handling. But it was in the curing barns that Jacob truly learned to hate tobacco. Those tall wooden structures with their ventilation slats and their rows of hanging leaves, because it was there that he spent countless hours in air so thick with dust and nicotine that his throat burned and his eyes watered, tying leaves onto sticks, hanging the sticks on tier poles, turning the leaves so they cured evenly, watching for mold or rot that could destroy weeks of work in a single night. The barns were miserable in the heat of late summer, stifling and close, and the work was tedious beyond measure. But Master Cornelius trusted only his most reliable workers in the barns, because a careless moment could mean financial ruin, fire being the constant terror that haunted every tobacco planter's dreams. Jacob was 17 when he first thought seriously about burning the barns down, the idea coming to him one sweltering September afternoon, as he hung tobacco in the eastern barn and listened to Master Cornelius shouting at Dinah for preparing his breakfast eggs incorrectly. His mother's voice filtered through the barn walls, apologizing, explaining, her tone carrying that particular flatness that enslaved people learn to adopt when addressing their owners. A voice scraped clean of all genuine feeling because genuine feeling was dangerous, could be interpreted as insolence, could lead to violence. Jacob had heard that voice his entire life, from his mother and from every other enslaved person on the plantation, and something about hearing it on that particular afternoon while his hands worked mechanically through the familiar motions of tying and hanging tobacco made him think about how quickly these barns would burn if someone were to set them alight, how thoroughly fire would erase a year's worth of work, how completely it would destroy the foundation of Master Cornelius's wealth. He did not act on the thought that day, or for many days afterward, because Jacob had been raised by a careful mother who taught him that survival meant thinking 10 steps ahead, considering every consequence, never acting on impulse when so much could go wrong. Dina had trained him to observe everything and reveal nothing, to appear simple while cataloging complex information, to move through the world as if he accepted his bondage while secretly believing he deserved freedom. She told him stories about Denmark Vesey, though she had to be careful how she told them because even speaking about slave rebellions could bring terrible punishment, and she made sure he understood that Vesey had been caught and hanged in Charleston in 1822 because someone had betrayed the plot, because keeping secrets among dozens or hundreds of people was nearly impossible, because the system of slavery was designed to turn the enslaved against each other through fear and self-preservation. So Jacob kept his thoughts about fire to himself and continued working through the seasons, watching Master Cornelius Marlowe walk his fields like a general surveying troops, watching Mistress Charlotte Marlowe arrange flowers in the big house while enslaved women scrubbed her floors, watching their son Robert Marlowe grow from boy to young man with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned whether he owned his own body. The Marlowes were not the cruelest enslavers in Virginia, which was a low bar to clear given the spectacular cruelties that some planters inflicted, but they were not kind either, and Jacob learned that moderate cruelty could grind a person down just as effectively as spectacular cruelty. The constant small humiliations and casual violence accumulating like sand in the soul until a person could barely remember what it felt like to live without that weight. When Jacob was 19, he was allowed to marry, which was not truly being allowed anything because enslaved people could not legally marry. But Master Cornelius permitted him to jump the broom with a young woman named Ruth who had been purchased from a neighboring plantation the previous year. Ruth was small and quick-witted, with hands that moved through work like birds in flight, and a laugh that she tried to hide because Mistress Charlotte said it was too loud and undignified. Jacob loved her immediately and terrifyingly, understanding even as he spoke his vows before their community that this love gave the Marlowes another weapon to use against him, that any child Ruth bore would belong not to them but to Master Cornelius, that the family he was building could be torn apart on auction block whenever the Marlowes needed money or felt inclined to punish someone. Ruth became pregnant within 4 months, and Jacob felt his hatred crystallize into something harder and clearer than it had ever been before, because now the mathematics of slavery included his son or daughter. Now the calculations of bondage encompassed another generation that would be born into chains unless something fundamental changed. He began to think again about the tobacco barns, but now his thinking was sharper, more focused, driven by the knowledge that he could not raise a child in this place, could not watch his son or daughter grow up learning the same lessons of submission and survival that had bent his mother's spine and taught him to hide his rage behind an obedient face. He said nothing to Ruth about his thoughts because involving her meant endangering her, and he said nothing to his mother for the same reason, but he began to observe the plantation with new eyes. cataloging details that might prove useful. He learned that Master Cornelius kept the tobacco barns locked only during the early weeks of curing when the leaves were most valuable and theft was a concern. But that later in the season, when the leaves had dried and the immediate risk had passed, the locks came off and the barns were accessible to anyone who had reason to be near them. He learned that the plantation kept its lamp oil in a shed near the blacksmith's forge, and that while the blacksmith Josiah kept careful watch during the day, at night the shed was secured with only a simple latch that could be opened silently if a person knew how to lift it just so. He learned that the Marlows and their overseers slept soundest on Sunday nights after a day of rest and often too much wine with dinner, and that the dogs were kenneled on the far side of the big house downwind from the tobacco barns, and might not immediately alert to smoke if the wind was blowing the right direction. Jacob stored these observations like coins saved toward a future purchase, not knowing exactly when he would spend them, but certain that the time would come. Ruth gave birth to a daughter in March of 1822, a tiny girl they named Sarah, who had her mother's quick eyes and her father's long fingers. And when Master Cornelius came to the cabin 3 days after the birth to record the child in his ledger, assigning her a value of $30 and noting her as property of the Marlowe estate, Jacob felt something break inside him that would not be repaired. He held his daughter while Ruth slept, feeling her warmth and weight, and understood with absolute clarity that he would burn down the entire plantation if it meant giving her a chance at freedom, that there was no punishment the Marlowes could inflict that would be worse than raising her in bondage. The summer of 1822 was brutally hot, the kind of heat that made the tobacco leaves droop by midday and forced everyone to work before dawn and after dusk, just to avoid the worst of the sun. The harvest came early that year, beginning in mid-August, and by the first week of September the curing barns were full of hanging tobacco. The year's entire crop, the foundation of the Marlowe family's income, hundreds of thousands of leaves turning slowly from green to gold in the close, hot darkness. Jacob worked in the barns as he always did, tying and hanging and turning, and while he worked he refined his plan, thinking through every detail, considering every variable, preparing for the moment when everything would either work or fail catastrophically. He decided on Sunday, September 15th, because the weather had been dry for 2 weeks and the tobacco would burn readily, because Master Cornelius had entertained guests from Richmond that weekend, and the big house had been full of wine and music until late Saturday night, because the next day was Monday, and the enslaved people would be scattered across the plantation at their various tasks, making it harder to immediately organize a search. He told no one, not even Ruth, because the only way to ensure a secret was to keep it absolutely, and because if he was caught he wanted to be able to swear truthfully that his wife and mother had known nothing about his plans. He spent Sunday working in his garden plot behind his cabin, appearing as he always appeared, thinking about the hours ahead with a calmness that surprised him. Night came slowly, the sun finally dropping behind the western tree line around 7 o'clock, and Jacob sat outside his cabin with Ruth and Sarah, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep blue, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into evening. Voices from other cabins, someone singing in the distance, the soft noises of animals bedding down for the night. Ruth nursed Sarah and spoke about her day, about how Mistress Charlotte wanted the rose garden weeded before the end of the week, about how her friend Mary had traded her some thread for a needle Sarah needed mending. Ordinary conversation about ordinary things, and Jacob listened and responded and tried to memorize the moment because he knew he would never have another one like it, sitting peacefully with his wife and daughter while the day ended and the world prepared for darkness. When full dark came around 9 o'clock and Ruth had put Sarah to bed, Jacob told her he was going to check on a sick mule in the barn, A lie that came easily because he had been lying to white people all his life, and the skill transferred smoothly to lying to people he loved when their safety required it. Ruth accepted the explanation without question, because why would she question it? And Jacob left the cabin carrying nothing but the clothes he wore, walking casually across the plantation grounds toward the equipment barn as if he had every right to be there. The moon was only a thin crescent, which was good, and clouds covered even that faint light, which was better. And Jacob felt his heart beat steady and slow as he moved through the darkness, all nervousness burning away to leave only clarity of purpose. The oil shed was where it had always been, the simple latch lifting exactly as he had practiced in his mind. And inside he found 2 large jars of lamp oil among the various supplies and tools. He carried both jars to the nearest tobacco barn, the eastern one, and slipped inside, pulling the door nearly closed behind him, but leaving a small gap so he would not be trapped if something went wrong. The barn was thick with the smell of curing tobacco, and in the darkness Jacob could barely see the tiers of hanging leaves, but he knew their location by memory. Knew exactly where the driest leaves hung in the upper tiers, where the air circulated best, and the curing was most complete. He worked quickly but not frantically, pouring oil in careful lines across the wooden floor, splashing it against the support posts, soaking rags and cloth scraps he found in a corner, and arranging them beneath the lowest tier of hanging tobacco. The oil made soft splashing sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet barn, and Jacob paused several times to listen for approaching footsteps, hearing nothing but the normal night sounds of insects and distant frogs. When the first jar was empty, he started on the second, moving deeper into the barn, creating a trail of oil that would ensure the fire spread quickly once it started. That would give him enough time to reach the other barns before anyone realized what was happening. The second jar was half empty when Jacob heard voices outside, 2 men talking, and he froze completely, barely breathing, recognizing the voices as belonging to Marcus and James, 2 enslaved men who worked in the stables and sometimes walked the grounds at night when they could not sleep. The voices grew closer, and Jacob pressed himself against the barn wall, still holding the jar of oil, knowing that if they came inside, everything would be over before it started. But the men passed by without stopping, their conversation about a horse with a sore hoof fading as they continued toward the stable. And after a full minute of listening, Jacob began moving again, finishing with the oil, setting the empty jars carefully in a corner where they might not be immediately noticed. He had brought flint and steel, stolen from the blacksmith's forge 2 days earlier, and he knelt now beside the oil-soaked rags beneath the dried tobacco, striking sparks in the darkness once, twice, 3 times before a spark caught, and a small flame bloomed orange and hungry. Jacob watched it for perhaps 10 seconds, watching it spread across the oil-soaked cloth, watching it climb toward the hanging tobacco leaves, watching it begin to truly burn. And then he was moving, slipping out of the barn and running low and fast toward the next barn, the western one, 50 yards away across open ground that felt like 50 miles in the moonless dark. The western barn took less time because Jacob was no longer being careful. Speed now more important than stealth, and he splashed the remaining oil from the jar he had hidden near this barn earlier in the day, poured it across the floor and against the walls, pulled out his flint and steel and struck sparks until another fire began to eat its way through cloth and wood and dried tobacco. Smoke was already visible from the eastern barn, a dark column rising against the stars, and Jacob knew he had perhaps 5 minutes before someone sounded an alarm, before the plantation erupted into chaos, before every available person was fighting to save what could be saved. He had planned to light only 2 barns to burn enough tobacco to cripple the Marlows financially without destroying the entire plantation. But now that he was running through the darkness with fires blooming behind him, now that he could smell smoke and hear the growing crackle of flames, something wild and fierce rose in his chest. and he found himself sprinting toward the southern barn, the largest of the three, the one that held nearly half the year's crop. He had no more oil, but he had fire, and he grabbed a burning stick from near the western barn and carried it like a torch, running with it held high. And when he reached the southern barn, he pushed through the door and touched the burning stick to every surface he could reach, setting smaller fires that would grow and merge and consume. This barn caught faster than the other two, the dry wood and dried tobacco seeming almost eager to burn, and Jacob had to shield his face from the heat as he backed out of the building, dropping the stick and stumbling into the open air where smoke was now thick enough to sting his eyes. He could hear shouts from the direction of the big house, could see lanterns being lit, could hear the alarm bell that Master Cornelius used to summon people in emergencies beginning its harsh clanging rhythm. Dogs started barking, and Jacob knew the moment of decision had arrived, the point where he either ran for the woods and freedom or returned to his cabin and pretended innocence. Running meant abandoning Ruth and Sarah, meant accepting that he would probably never see them again, meant choosing his own freedom over his family. Staying meant risking capture and execution, meant trusting that no one had seen him, meant gambling that he could successfully pretend to be just another enslaved person responding to an emergency. Jacob stood for perhaps 30 seconds watching the three barns burn, watching the flames climb higher than the tree line, watching the night turn orange and red and gold. And in those 30 seconds he made his choice based not on strategy but on love, because he could not leave Ruth and Sarah to face the Marlowe's rage alone, could not allow them to suffer for what he had done, could not walk away from the two people who made his life bearable even as he burned down the world they inhabited. He ran toward his cabin, moving with the panicked urgency of someone responding to disaster rather than fleeing from it. And he reached his door just as Ruth emerged carrying Sarah, her eyes wide with fear as she looked toward the fires. Jacob grabbed her arm, pulled her close, and in a voice that carried all the authority he could muster, told her to get to the fire line, to help with the bucket brigade, to be visible and useful and entirely uninvolved. Ruth looked at him with sudden understanding in her eyes, a flash of comprehension that he saw and tried to deny. And then she was moving toward the growing crowd of people near the eastern barn, joining the enslaved workers who were already forming lines to pass buckets of water that would do absolutely nothing to stop the inferno he had created. The next hours were chaos, people shouting and running, buckets splashing, the Marlowe's screaming orders that made no difference because the fires were already beyond control. All three barns burning with such intensity that the heat pushed people back and made approaching them impossible. Master Cornelius raged like a man possessed, his face twisted with fury and horror as he watched his fortune turn to ash, and he grabbed enslaved people at random and shook them and demanded to know how this had happened, who was responsible, why no one had seen anything. The overseer Crawford organized a bucket brigade despite the obvious futility, perhaps because having people do something was better than having them stand idle. And Jacob joined the line and passed buckets until his arms ached, working alongside Ruth and his mother and dozens of others, all of them watching the fires with mixed expressions that they tried to hide from the white faces around them. By midnight, the barns had collapsed, their wooden frames giving way and sending up huge clouds of sparks that rose into the night sky like swarms of fireflies. The flames were still burning, but the immediate danger had passed, no longer threatening to spread to other buildings. And Master Cornelius had stopped shouting and now stood in terrible silence, staring at the ruins of his crop, his income, his year's work. Mistress Charlotte had retired to the big house, overcome by smoke and shock, and young Robert Marlowe sat on the ground near his father, looking pale and lost. The overseer Crawford walked the perimeter of the fires carrying a rifle, his eyes scanning the crowd of enslaved people with open suspicion, looking for anyone who appeared less than devastated by the loss. Jacob made sure his face showed appropriate concern and confusion, made sure he stayed visible and engaged, made sure to express wonder and horror in equal measure when talking to other enslaved people about how such a disaster could have occurred. Most people seemed to genuinely believe it was an accident, a lamp left burning or a spark from someone's pipe, because who would deliberately destroy the tobacco barns and risk the collective punishment that would surely follow such an act? But Jacob saw his mother's eyes on him several times during the night, saw her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, and he wondered if she suspected, if she had heard something or seen something that connected him to the fires. Dawn came slowly, revealing the full extent of the destruction. 3 barns reduced to smoldering ruins, hundreds of thousands of tobacco leaves burned beyond recovery. An entire year's crop transformed overnight into charcoal and ash. Master Cornelius walked the ruins in the gray light, his boots crunching on burned wood, and his face held the blank expression of a man whose mind cannot process the scale of his loss. The Marlows were not poor. They owned land and enslaved people and had resources to fall back on, but losing an entire tobacco crop meant debts would go unpaid, luxuries would be curtailed, social standing would suffer. In the rigid hierarchy of Virginia plantation society, financial setbacks carried social consequences, and everyone on the plantation understood that those consequences would flow downward like water seeking the lowest point. The questions began in earnest that morning, Crawford and Master Cornelius interrogating enslaved people individually and in groups, trying to establish who had been where, who had seen what, whether anyone had noticed anything suspicious. Jacob was questioned twice, first by Crawford and then by Master Cornelius himself, and both times he maintained the same story about being in his cabin with his family until the alarm sounded, about joining the bucket brigade immediately, about having no knowledge of how the fires started. He made his voice steady and his eyes direct, calling on every lesson his mother had taught him about appearing simple and earnest, and both men seemed to accept his account, though Crawford's eyes lingered on him with something like suspicion before moving on to the next person. No one was directly accused that first day, but a tension settled over the plantation like morning fog, thick and cold and suffocating. Master Cornelius announced that he would be hiring an investigator from Richmond, someone experienced in questioning enslaved people and uncovering conspiracies. And the threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Everyone knew the methods such investigators used, the casual tortures employed to extract confessions, the willingness to punish many to uncover one. Jacob felt fear touch his spine for the first time since lighting the fires, understanding that his plan had perhaps been too bold, that he had assumed he could disappear into the collective population of the plantation when in fact he might stand out precisely because he had tried so hard to blend in. 3 days after the fires, on Wednesday evening, Jacob was working in the vegetable garden when his mother approached and knelt beside him, ostensibly to help with the weeding, but actually to speak quietly while appearing to focus on her work. She told him without preamble that she knew what he had done, that she had seen him near the oil shed on Sunday night and had watched him walking with purpose toward the eastern barn, that she had said nothing and would continue to say nothing, but that he needed to understand the danger he had created not just for himself, but for everyone on the plantation. Her voice held no anger, only a terrible weariness, and Jacob felt shame rise in his throat even as he tried to deny her accusations. Dina cut through his denials with the efficiency of someone who had spent her entire life cutting through lies, and she told him that his choices were now limited to 2 paths. He could stay and hope the investigator from Richmond found nothing, could continue to maintain his innocence and pray that no evidence connected him to the fires, and if he succeeded, then life would eventually return to some version of normal, though the plantation would be poorer and everyone would be watched more carefully. Or he could run now, tonight before the investigator arrived, could take whatever small head start he might gain and use it to reach the mountains or the coast or somewhere beyond the Marlowe's reach, though running meant confirming his guilt and would almost certainly result in terrible punishment for those he left behind, as Master Cornelius sought to satisfy his rage by making examples of Jacob's family and friends. Jacob listened to his mother lay out these options in her quiet, steady voice, and he felt the weight of his choice settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. If he ran, Ruth and Sarah would suffer. His mother would suffer, possibly others would suffer as the Marlowes lashed out at anyone connected to him. If he stayed, he risked torture and execution, but at least he would be present to potentially shield his family from the worst consequences, to draw the Marlowes' attention and anger onto himself and away from innocent people. His mother told him she could not make this choice for him, that he had stepped beyond her guidance when he lit those fires, that he was a man now and men had to live with the consequences of their decisions. That night, Jacob lay beside Ruth in their cabin, listening to Sarah's soft breathing from her cradle, and he thought about freedom and family and what it meant to choose between them. Ruth knew something was wrong. He could tell from the way she watched him in the darkness, but she did not ask questions because perhaps she did not want to hear answers that would force her to make impossible choices. He thought about running, really running, heading north toward Washington and then Pennsylvania and the promise of free soil. Thought about what it would feel like to wake up in a place where he owned his own body and his own time. Thought about cities he had heard described where black people walked freely and worked for wages and lived in their own houses. The thought was intoxicating and terrible in equal measure, a dream so powerful it made his chest ache. But every time he reached toward that dream, he saw Ruth's face and Sarah's tiny hands and his mother's bent back, and the dream turned to ash in his mouth. By Friday morning, Jacob had made his decision, or rather had accepted that the decision had been made for him by love and obligation, and the web of relationships that bound him to this place more surely than any chains. He would stay, would continue to maintain his innocence, would face whatever the Richmond investigator brought with the same careful mask he had worn his entire life. If he was caught and punished, at least Ruth and Sarah might be spared the worst of it. At least they would not have to bear the stigma of being a fugitive's family. At least they would remain on the Marlowe plantation where Dina could help protect them rather than being sold off to some harsher place as punishment for Jacob's escape. The investigator arrived on Saturday, a thin man named Parsons who came with an assistant and a reputation for extracting confessions through a combination of psychological pressure and carefully calibrated physical pain. Master Cornelius gave him free access to the enslaved population, and Parsons began his work methodically, interviewing people in the overseer's office one by one, comparing stories, looking for inconsistencies. Jacob was called for questioning on Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the fires, and he walked to the office with his heart hammering but his face calm, prepared to lie with every skill he possessed. Parsons was soft-spoken and precise, his questions coming in gentle tones that made them somehow more menacing than Crawford's blunt interrogations. He asked Jacob about his movements on the night of the fire, about his access to the oil shed, about his knowledge of the tobacco barns, about his attitude toward Master Cornelius and the Marlowe family. Jacob answered each question carefully, measuring his words, maintaining his story, showing neither fear nor defiance because both would be interpreted as guilt. Parsons watched him with pale eyes that seemed to look through skin to the bones beneath, and Jacob could feel the man cataloging every gesture, every pause, every breath. The questioning lasted 2 hours, and by the end Jacob's shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool autumn air. But he had not wavered from his account, and Parsons had found no obvious holes in his story. The investigator dismissed him with instructions to remain available for additional questions, and Jacob walked back to his cabin feeling hollowed out and exhausted. wondering if he had done enough or if Parsons had already seen through his lies and was simply gathering evidence before making an arrest. He found Ruth waiting with Sarah, and he held them both for a long time without speaking, trying to memorize the feeling of their warmth and weight because he could not shake the sense that his time with them was running out. Days passed and more people were questioned, the investigator working through the entire enslaved population with patient thoroughness. But no arrests were made, and no public accusations were leveled. The plantation settled into an uneasy routine, fieldwork continuing but with an undercurrent of tension, everyone wondering when the axe would fall and whose neck would be beneath it. Master Cornelius spent his days calculating losses and writing letters to creditors, and Mistress Charlotte took to her bed with mysterious ailments that required constant attention from the house servants. Young Robert Marlowe began taking a more active role in plantation management, often standing beside Crawford during morning work assignments, learning the business of slavery from a man who had made that business his life's work. 2 weeks after the fires, Jacob was working in the fields when Crawford approached and told him Master Cornelius wanted to see him at the big house immediately. Jacob's heart dropped, certain this was the moment of accusation. But he kept his face neutral and followed Crawford across the plantation grounds, preparing himself for whatever was coming. They entered the big house through the back door, something enslaved people only did when summoned, and Crawford led him to Master Cornelius's study where the planter sat behind his desk with Parsons standing beside him and Jacob's mother Dina standing in the corner looking smaller and older than he had ever seen her. Master Cornelius spoke without preamble, his voice flat and hard, and he told Jacob that Parsons had concluded his investigation and determined that the fires were likely the result of deliberate arson rather than accident, that the pattern of burning and the evidence of lamp oil on the barn floors made this conclusion undeniable. Jacob's throat went dry, but he said nothing, waiting. And Master Cornelius continued by saying that unfortunately Parsons had not been able to identify the specific perpetrator, that despite exhaustive questioning no one had provided information that conclusively pointed to any individual or group. The planter's eyes were cold as he spoke, and Jacob understood that Master Cornelius probably suspected him but lacked proof, that he was delivering this information as much as a warning, as a report. Then Master Cornelius said something that Jacob had not expected, that he had decided not to pursue the matter further, that continuing the investigation would only keep the plantation in a state of disruption when what they needed was to move forward, to plant new crops, to rebuild. He was dismissing Parsons and sending him back to Richmond, and life on the plantation would return to normal with the understanding that increased vigilance would be maintained and any future suspicious incidents would be met with immediate and severe consequences. Jacob felt confusion and relief war in his chest, unable to understand why Master Cornelius would simply let the matter drop when an entire year's income had burned, when the crime demanded punishment not just for justice but as a deterrent against future rebellion. As if reading his thoughts, Master Cornelius stood and walked to where Dina stood against the wall, and he placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that could have been paternal but felt more like possession, and he said that some people on the plantation were more valuable than others, that some relationships mattered more than abstract justice, that Dina had been with the Marlowe family for 24 years and had earned certain considerations. Jacob's eyes went to his mother and saw resignation in her face, saw the set of her shoulders that meant she had made a bargain, and in that moment he understood the price of his freedom from accusation. His mother had gone to Master Cornelius and had offered something, her silence or her service, or perhaps simply her dignity, in exchange for her son's protection. And the planter had accepted because Dina was indeed valuable, skilled in ways that made her difficult to replace, and because perhaps some small part of Cornelius Marlowe was capable of recognizing loyalty even in a person he owned. Jacob was dismissed, told to return to his work, and he left the big house with his mother walking beside him in silence. When they were far enough away that no one could hear, she told him simply that he owed her a debt now, that she had called in every favor and spent every bit of goodwill she had accumulated over 24 years of servitude to protect him from his own recklessness, that he would live with what he had done and he would make it mean something rather than wasting the sacrifice she had made to save him. Her voice was sharp and tired, and Jacob wanted to apologize but understood that no apology would be adequate, that he had put his need for dramatic gesture above the safety of everyone he loved, that his mother was right to be angry even as she was right to protect him. The weeks that followed were strange and difficult, the plantation slowly recovering from both the fires and the investigation, but nothing felt settled or resolved. Jacob returned to his regular work, the seasonal tasks that filled every day regardless of larger dramas, but he felt watched in ways he had not before, felt Crawford's eyes following him, felt other enslaved people keeping distance from him as if they suspected something and wanted no association if suspicion ever hardened into accusation. Only Ruth remained constant, staying close, caring for Sarah, maintaining the routines of their life together, though Jacob sometimes caught her looking at him with questions in her eyes that she never voiced. Winter came early that year, cold and harsh, and the plantation struggled through shortened rations as Master Cornelius dealt with his financial losses by reducing expenses wherever possible. The enslaved population bore the brunt of these reductions, meals getting smaller, clothing allotments being delayed, medical care becoming even more grudging than usual. Jacob watched his daughter begin to look thin, watched Ruth's face grow gaunt, and felt guilt settle into his bones like frost, understanding that his act of rebellion had harmed the very people he had meant to protect. His mother had been right about the cost of his choices, right about the way violence and resistance in the context of slavery always seemed to result in the oppressed suffering most. Right that his burning of the tobacco barns had been more about his own need to strike back than any realistic strategy for gaining freedom. But even as Jacob wrestled with guilt and regret, he could not entirely extinguish the fierce satisfaction he felt when he thought about those barns burning, about the look on Master Cornelius's face as he watched his fortune turn to ash, about the way the flames had lit the sky for miles around and had surely been visible to enslaved people on neighboring plantations, who would hear the story and know that someone had struck a blow against the system that held them all in bondage. The fires had not freed anyone, had not fundamentally changed the structure of slavery in Virginia, but they had proven that the enslaved were not entirely powerless, that the architecture of oppression could be damaged by those it was designed to crush. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it the cycle of planting began again, though on a reduced scale because Master Cornelius lacked the capital to plant all 800 acres. He divided the fields differently that year, putting more land into corn and wheat, crops that required less intensive labor and carried less financial risk, keeping only 200 acres in tobacco. The change meant different work patterns, different rhythms to the days, and Jacob found himself assigned more often to the grain fields than to tobacco cultivation, which suited him fine because he had come to hate tobacco with an intensity that went beyond reason, seeing in its broad leaves and demanding nature everything that was wrong with the system of plantation slavery. Ruth's garden became more important that year, the vegetables she grew supplementing the reduced rations that Master Cornelius provided. And Jacob spent his evening hours helping her tend the plants, weeding and watering and harvesting, finding in the simple work a kind of peace that field labor never provided. Sarah grew through that spring and summer, learning to walk and then to run, her laughter occasionally breaking through the grimness that had settled over the plantation since the fires. Jacob watched her play and tried to imagine what kind of life she might have, whether she would grow up to work in the fields as he had, whether she would be sold away when Master Cornelius needed money, whether she would ever know anything beyond the boundaries of the Marlowe plantation. In late summer of 1823, nearly a year after the fires, a traveler came through Henrico County spreading news that was whispered from plantation to plantation. News about a rebellion that had been planned in Charleston, about a man named Denmark Vesey, who had organized hundreds of enslaved people to rise up and seize the city, about how the plot had been betrayed and Vesey and 34 others had been hanged. The news arrived in fragments and rumors, details shifting depending on who was telling the story, but the core remained constant. Another attempt at freedom had been crushed. Another group of brave or foolish men had paid with their lives for daring to imagine that they could break their chains through violence. Jacob heard the stories and felt a complicated mix of emotions: admiration for Vesey's courage, sorrow for his failure, recognition of his own face in that distant mirror. He had not organized a rebellion, had acted alone rather than building a conspiracy. But the fundamental impulse had been the same: the need to do something, to strike back, to refuse to accept bondage passively. The difference was that Vesey had been caught and executed while Jacob had escaped through a combination of his mother's sacrifice and Master Cornelius's pragmatism, and he did not know whether that made him lucky or cowardly or simply more careful in his choice of target and timing. His mother seemed to read his thoughts because one evening she found him sitting outside his cabin staring toward where the tobacco barns had stood. And she told him that Vesey's rebellion had failed because it relied on secrecy that was impossible to maintain. Because slavery created conditions where betrayal was always more profitable than solidarity. Because no matter how justified the violence, it would be met with overwhelming counter-violence that would fall not just on the conspirators but on every black person within reach. She told him that his burning of the barns had been reckless, but at least it had been contained, aimed at property rather than people, limited in scope in ways that had allowed the plantation to absorb the damage without erupting into the kind of retaliatory violence that often followed slave rebellions. Dina was not telling him this to praise his actions, but to help him understand the narrow path he had walked between effective resistance and suicidal gesture, between striking a meaningful blow and simply inviting destruction upon himself and everyone he loved. She told him that if he truly wanted to help his family, if he truly wanted to give Sarah a chance at something better, then he needed to think beyond dramatic gestures, needed to consider the long, patient work of survival and preparation, needed to learn that resistance came in many forms and not all of them involved fire and violence. Jacob listened to his mother and tried to absorb her wisdom, but part of him remained stubbornly attached to the memory of those flames climbing into the night sky. Remained convinced that some acts mattered not because they achieved practical results, but because they refused to accept the unacceptable. He understood his mother's pragmatism, recognized that she had survived and protected her son through careful negotiation and strategic submission. But he also understood that survival alone was not enough, that there had to be moments when a person stood up and said no. Even if the consequences were terrible, even if the gesture seemed futile, even if wiser voices counseled patience and accommodation. The years passed slowly after that, each season blending into the next in the way that time moved on plantations where every year was fundamentally the same as the year before. The same planting and harvest, the same labor and exhaustion, the same small joys and large sorrows. Sarah grew into a bright and curious child, asking questions that Jacob sometimes struggled to answer because how did you explain to a 5-year-old why she could not leave the plantation, why she had to work when white children played, why her value was measured in dollars and recorded in a ledger? Ruth aged visibly under the weight of constant work and insufficient food, her quick movements becoming slower, her laughter becoming rarer, and Jacob felt helpless rage at his inability to protect her from the grinding cruelty of slavery. Master Cornelius recovered financially from the loss of the tobacco crop, the plantation's reduced but steady income eventually repaying debts and restoring some of the family's social standing. He never planted tobacco on the scale he had before the fires, seeming to have learned caution from the disaster, diversifying his crops and reducing his dependence on any single harvest. He also never mentioned the fires directly to Jacob again, but sometimes Jacob would catch the planter looking at him with an expression that suggested private knowledge, a certainty about Jacob's guilt that lacked only proof, and Jacob would return the look with studied blankness, maintaining the performance of innocence that had become second nature. In 1826, when Sarah was 4 years old, Master Cornelius sold 2 enslaved men to a trader heading to the Deep South cotton plantations. And the sales sent waves of terror through the enslaved community because everyone knew that being sold south was often a death sentence, that the brutal labor conditions and disease made the cotton plantations into places from which few returned. Jacob watched the men being chained and loaded into the trader's wagon, watched their families weeping and trying to say goodbye, and he felt the old rage kindle in his chest, the familiar desire to burn something down, to strike back against a system that treated human beings as fungible commodities to be bought and sold at will. But he did nothing because Dina's words had taken root in his mind, because he had learned through hard experience that dramatic gestures often hurt more than they helped, because he had Ruth and Sarah to think about and could not risk actions that would result in them being sold away. So he swallowed his rage and continued working and tried to find meaning in the small acts of resistance that filled everyday life on the plantation. The work deliberately done slowly, the tools accidentally broken, the feigned ignorance that forced overseers to explain things repeatedly, the songs that carried coded messages about freedom and judgment and the eventual reckoning that surely must come. In 1827, Jacob turned 25 years old, a quarter century of life spent entirely in bondage, and he found himself thinking about time in ways he never had before, wondering how many years he had left, whether he would die enslaved as his mother surely would, whether Sarah would reach adulthood still owned by the Marlows or some other white family who had purchased her. The weight of these thoughts sometimes made it hard to rise in the morning, hard to face another day of labor that benefited someone else, hard to maintain the performance of contentment that slavery required from the enslaved. Ruth seemed to sense his despair because she began talking to him about escape in ways she never had before, whispering at night about routes north, about people who helped fugitive slaves, about Pennsylvania and the promise of freedom that lay just a few hundred miles away. Jacob listened and felt torn because escape was the dream that sustained many enslaved people but was also extraordinarily dangerous, requiring resources and knowledge and luck that most people did not possess. The fugitive slave laws meant that even reaching free soil did not guarantee safety, that slave catchers could pursue and capture the escaped even in the North, that the only true security lay in reaching Canada, which was even further away and even more difficult to reach. He told Ruth that if they ran, they would have to leave his mother behind, that she was too old and too closely watched to make the journey, that they would be abandoning her to face whatever punishment the Marlows decided to inflict. Ruth argued that his mother would want them to go, that Dina had spent her entire life in bondage and would not want the same for her granddaughter, that sometimes love meant leaving even when it broke your heart. Jacob knew she was right but could not reconcile himself to the abandonment, could not imagine walking away from the woman who had protected him, who had sacrificed her standing and her safety to shield him from the consequences of burning the tobacco barns. The debate continued through the fall and into the winter, Ruth gradually wearing down Jacob's resistance with patient logic and emotional appeals. until by spring of 1828 he had half convinced himself that escape was possible, that they could gather supplies and information, that they could wait for the right moment and simply walk away from the plantation and keep walking until they crossed into free territory. He began to prepare in small ways, hiding food that would not spoil, acquiring a knife and flint and steel, listening carefully when travelers passed through and mentioned roads and towns and distances. He told no one of his plans, not even his mother, because he had learned that secrets kept one person safe were secrets that could not betray anyone else. In June of that year, Master Cornelius announced that he would be traveling to Richmond for business and would be gone for a week, leaving the plantation in the hands of the overseer Crawford and his assistants. Jacob saw opportunity in the master's absence, reasoning that Crawford would be overwhelmed with managing the entire operation and might not immediately notice if one family failed to appear for work assignments, that the delay could give them a crucial head start before pursuit was organized. He told Ruth to prepare, to gather what little they could carry, to be ready to leave on 3 days' notice, and she agreed with a mixture of excitement and terror that Jacob recognized because he felt exactly the same way. But then Sarah fell ill with a fever that left her listless and hot to the touch, and Ruth spent sleepless nights bathing her with cool water and trying to coax food into her. And the planned escape had to be postponed because they could not run with a sick child, could not carry her the necessary distances when she could barely lift her head. Jacob felt frustration war with concern as he watched his daughter struggle through the illness, and he realized that having a child made escape exponentially more difficult, that they could not move quickly or hide easily when they had to account for Sarah's needs and limitations. Sarah recovered after 10 days, the fever breaking and her appetite returning, but by then Master Cornelius had returned from Richmond and the opportunity had passed. Jacob told himself there would be other chances, that they would watch and wait and prepare, that eventually the right moment would present itself. But part of him wondered if he was simply making excuses, if he would ever actually have the courage to run, or if he would spend his entire life planning an escape that never happened while the years slipped away and Sarah grew up in chains. In 1829, the plantation experienced a good harvest, and Master Cornelius's mood improved noticeably, the planter walking the fields with something like contentment, pleased with his crops and his workers and his place in the world. For the enslaved population, this meant marginally better rations and fewer arbitrary punishments, small mercies that made daily life slightly less unbearable. Jacob found himself thinking that if slavery could be this version of itself, this relatively benign arrangement where food was adequate and violence was restrained, then perhaps life could be tolerable. And then he would feel disgusted with himself for the thought, because slavery was never tolerable no matter how kind the master, because the fundamental wrong could not be erased by treating the enslaved slightly better than they could be treated. His mother's health began to decline that year, age and hard labor finally catching up with her, and Jacob watched her move more slowly, saw her wince when she thought no one was looking, heard her breathing grow labored after even light work. He tried to help her by taking on additional tasks, doing her work when he could get away with it, but Crawford noticed and warned him sharply that every person was expected to complete their own assignments, and helping Dina just meant she would be given more work to bring her up to her quota. The logic was cruel but typical of slavery, which measured people only by their productivity and had no room for accommodation or mercy when that productivity declined. Dina continued working through increasing pain until finally, in the winter of 1830, she collapsed in the big house kitchen while preparing breakfast, falling to the floor and unable to rise. Mistress Charlotte summoned the overseer, who summoned Jacob, who carried his mother to her cabin and laid her on her bed and knew from looking at her that she was dying. He sat with her through that day and night, Ruth bringing food that Dina barely touched, Sarah climbing onto the bed to cuddle against her grandmother with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. Dina drifted in and out of consciousness, and during her lucid moments she spoke to Jacob about things she had never mentioned before, about her own mother whom she barely remembered, about her childhood before she was sold to the Marlows, about a man she had loved who had been sold away before Jacob was born. She told him she was tired, that she had fought long enough, that she was ready to rest and he should not mourn her except to regret that she had lived her entire life in bondage. She told him to take Ruth and Sarah and run, to not let her death anchor him to this place, to find freedom because she never could. Jacob held her hand and promised, though he did not know if he was lying or telling the truth, if he would actually be able to follow through once she was gone. Dina died just before dawn, slipping away so quietly that Jacob did not immediately realize she had stopped breathing. And he sat holding her cooling hand and felt something break inside him that had already been cracked since the night he burned the tobacco barns. Master Cornelius allowed a day for burial, and the enslaved community gathered in the small cemetery beyond the fields to lay Dina Harris to rest in the Virginia soil she had worked for 32 years. There was no marker beyond a wooden cross, no recording of her life beyond the line in Master Cornelius's ledger noting her death and the loss of her value to the estate. Jacob stood at the graveside with Ruth and Sarah and tried to find meaning in his mother's life, tried to believe that her years had mattered, that her strength and wisdom had made a difference. But mostly he just felt angry that someone so remarkable had been reduced to property, that her entire existence had been defined by her relationship to the people who owned her. In the weeks after Dina's death, Jacob found himself thinking constantly about her final words, her instruction to run, her release of him from the obligation he felt to stay near her grave. The world felt different without her presence, emptier and colder, and for the first time Jacob seriously contemplated escape not as a distant possibility, but as an immediate necessity. He was 28 years old, young enough to make the journey north, old enough to have accumulated the skills and knowledge that might allow him to survive as a fugitive. Sarah was 7 and strong for her age, capable of walking long distances if necessary. Ruth was 30 and healthy despite the years of hard labor. They could do this, Jacob thought. They could actually attempt it, and maybe this time he would not let fear or obligation hold him back. He began preparing in earnest, gathering supplies more boldly than before, questioning travelers more directly, building a mental map of the routes north. He learned that Washington was 100 miles away, that from there Pennsylvania was another 100 miles, that Canada was the ultimate goal, but Pennsylvania represented at least temporary safety. He learned about the risks, about slave catchers who patrolled the roads, about rewards posted for fugitives, about the likelihood of betrayal by people both black and white who valued the reward money more than they valued another person's freedom. But he also learned about people who helped, about safe houses along what some called the Underground Railroad, about signals and passwords that could identify allies. Jacob shared his planning with Ruth, showing her what he had learned, explaining his thinking. And together they made the decision to attempt escape in the spring, when the weather would be mild and the longer days would give them more time to travel before darkness forced them to hide. They would take only what they could carry, would move at night and hide during the day, would avoid roads where possible and stick to forests and fields. They had no guaranteed contacts, no names of specific people who might help them, but Jacob reasoned that once they crossed into free territory, they could seek assistance from the black communities that existed in northern cities, could find work and shelter and begin building a life outside of slavery's reach. The winter of 1830 into 1831 passed slowly, Jacob and Ruth continuing their daily work while secretly preparing for the journey ahead. and Jacob found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The position of the North Star, the patterns of patrols by Crawford and his assistants, the rhythms of plantation life that might create windows of opportunity. He also found himself saying silent goodbyes to places and people, understanding that if they succeeded in escaping, he would never return to Virginia, would never see the Marlowe plantation again, would become someone entirely new in some distant place he could barely imagine. In early April, as the spring planting was beginning and the plantation was busy with preparation, Jacob decided the time had come. He told Ruth to be ready, that they would leave in 3 days on a moonless night when darkness would provide maximum cover. Ruth accepted the plan with a calmness that surprised him, and Jacob realized she had been waiting for this moment since long before he was ready to commit to it. That her patience had been a gift she gave him while he worked through his fears and doubts. They told Sarah only that they were going on a long walk, not wanting to burden her with the enormity of what they were attempting, knowing that children could not be expected to keep secrets under pressure. The night they chose was cloudy and still, the darkness complete, and Jacob waited until he heard the plantation settling into sleep before waking Ruth and Sarah and leading them quietly out of their cabin and toward the eastern edge of the property where forest provided cover. They moved slowly at first, Jacob carrying Sarah when she grew tired, Ruth carrying their small bundle of supplies, and by dawn they were 5 miles from the plantation, hidden in a dense thicket waiting for daylight to pass so they could continue traveling. Sarah slept curled against Ruth, and Jacob kept watch, listening for sounds of pursuit that did not come, wondering if Crawford had even noticed their absence yet or if he assumed they were working in some distant part of the plantation. They traveled like this for 3 nights, covering perhaps 15 miles per night, moving through a landscape that was both familiar and completely unknown to Jacob, who had never been more than a few miles from the plantation in any direction. They saw other people occasionally, mostly at a distance, and Jacob steered them away from all contact because he could not know who might be trustworthy and who might see only a reward for turning in fugitive slaves. They ate sparingly from their supplies and drank from streams, and Sarah bore the journey better than Jacob had hoped, staying quiet when quiet was needed, walking when she could and riding on his shoulders when she could not. On the 4th night they reached what Jacob thought must be the outskirts of Washington, seeing more houses and roads, more signs of dense population, and he felt both exhilaration and terror because cities meant both opportunity and danger. Places where they might find help, but also where they were most likely to be noticed and reported. They hid during the day in an abandoned barn, and Jacob wrestled with the decision of whether to try to pass through Washington or skirt around it, weighing the risks of visibility against the possibility of making contact with people who could help them on the next leg of their journey. While they rested in the barn, Sarah asked questions that Jacob had been dreading, wanting to know why they were hiding, where they were going, why they could not go back to the plantation. Jacob tried to explain in terms a 7-year-old could understand, talking about freedom and ownership, about how some people thought they had the right to control other people's lives, about how he and Ruth wanted Sarah to grow up in a place where no one could sell her or tell her what to do. Sarah listened with her serious eyes and then asked if they would ever see grandmother Dina again. And Jacob had to explain that his mother was gone, that they were making this journey partly because she had wanted them to be free even though she never could be. They moved on that night, skirting the edges of Washington rather than entering the city, following what Jacob hoped was a northern trajectory based on the stars and his limited understanding of geography. The landscape began to change, growing hillier, the farms and plantations giving way to smaller holdings, and Jacob felt hope that they were making progress toward Pennsylvania and freedom. But on the 6th night, As they were crossing an open field, they heard dogs barking in the distance, a sound that sent ice through Jacob's veins because he knew what it meant. Knew that slave catchers used dogs to track fugitives. Knew that they had somehow been discovered and pursuit had been organized. They ran. Jacob carrying Sarah and pulling Ruth along, trying to reach the tree line before the dogs closed the distance. But the animals were faster, and within minutes they could hear them crashing through the brush behind them. Jacob made it to the trees and kept running, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him. Sarah whimpering against his shoulder and Ruth gasping beside him, and behind them the dogs were snarling and the voices of men were shouting, and Jacob knew they were not going to make it, that 6 nights of freedom were all they would have before being dragged back to Virginia, and whatever punishment Master Cornelius would inflict. But then the ground dropped away beneath his feet and he was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment with Sarah clutched to his chest, hitting rocks and roots, the world spinning, until he crashed into cold water at the bottom, a stream or small river, the shock of it driving the air from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, still holding Sarah, looking wildly for Ruth and seeing her sliding down the embankment above him, hitting the water with a splash, going under and coming up coughing. The dogs were at the top of the embankment, barking frantically, and Jacob could hear men's voices arguing about whether to come down or wait for morning light. Jacob pulled Ruth to her feet and they waded downstream, moving as quickly as they could through water that came up to their waists. Sarah crying quietly and Ruth's breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold water numbed Jacob's legs and the current pulled at them. But he kept moving, kept following the stream because water would hide their scent from the dogs, would make tracking them harder, even if not impossible. They stayed in the water for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, until Jacob's legs were cramping and Sarah was shaking with cold, and Ruth was barely able to stand, and then he pulled them up onto the far bank and into a dense stand of evergreens where they collapsed together in a shivering heap. Morning came gray and cold, and Jacob knew they could not stay where they were, that the slave catchers would widen their search and eventually find them. He also knew they could not keep running, that they were wet and exhausted, and Sarah was showing signs of the same fever she had suffered before. Her skin hot despite the cold water, her eyes glassy. Jacob felt the weight of his failure settle onto him like a physical burden, understanding that his attempt to free his family had only made their situation worse, that the punishment for attempted escape would be severe, that he had put Ruth and Sarah through hardship and terror for nothing. Ruth seemed to sense his despair because she touched his face and told him they had to keep trying, that going back was not an option, that even if they were caught, at least they had tried. Her words pulled Jacob out of his spiral of self-pity, and he forced himself to think practically, to assess their situation and determine next steps. They needed shelter, needed to get Sarah warm and dry, needed to find food because their supplies had been lost in the fall down the embankment. He thought they were probably still in Virginia, probably only 50 or 60 miles from the plantation, nowhere near Pennsylvania and the promise of freedom. They spent that day hidden in the evergreens, Jacob venturing out briefly to find berries and edible plants, anything that might sustain them. Sarah's fever worsened through the afternoon, and Ruth held her and sang quietly. The same songs Dina had sung when Jacob was young, songs about deliverance and the promised land and freedom beyond the river. Jacob listened and felt grief rise in his throat, not just for his mother, but for everything they had lost and were losing, for the impossibility of the situation they found themselves in, for the brutal unfairness of a world where trying to own your own life was a crime deserving pursuit and punishment. By evening, Sarah's condition had deteriorated to the point where Jacob knew they needed help, that his daughter might die without proper care, that his attempt to free her had put her life in immediate danger. He made the decision that he had been avoiding, the choice between Sarah's safety and their freedom. And he told Ruth that he was going to find the nearest farm or plantation and ask for help, even knowing it would likely result in their capture and return to the Marlows. Ruth argued briefly but subsided when she looked at Sarah's flushed face and labored breathing, understanding that some choices were not really choices at all. Jacob left Ruth and Sarah hidden in the evergreens and walked toward lights he could see in the distance, across fields and down a road until he reached a large farmhouse where smoke rose from the chimney. He approached the front door knowing this could be the end of his bid for freedom, knowing he was gambling everything on the possibility that whoever lived here might show mercy to a desperate father with a sick child. He knocked and waited, and the door opened to reveal a middle-aged white man with skeptical eyes, and Jacob spoke quickly before the man could slam the door or reach for a weapon, explaining that his daughter was sick, that he needed help, that he would accept any consequence if someone would just look at the child. The man studied Jacob for a long moment, and Jacob could not read his expression, could not tell if he was looking at someone sympathetic or someone calculating reward money. Then the man called over his shoulder to his wife, and a woman appeared, and the man told her to bring medicine and blankets, and he told Jacob to lead him to where the child was hidden. Jacob felt dizzy with relief and confusion, unable to understand why this stranger was helping rather than capturing. But he led the way back to the evergreens where Ruth sat rocking Sarah, and the white man and his wife knelt beside the sick child and examined her with practiced efficiency. The woman pronounced it a serious fever, but likely treatable with rest and proper care, and she told Jacob they would take Sarah to their house and nurse her through the worst of it, and that he and Ruth were welcome to stay as well, though they would need to hide in the barn because while this household opposed slavery, they were still in Virginia, and there were laws and neighbors to consider. Jacob felt tears on his face as he carried Sarah to the farmhouse, barely able to process that they had stumbled upon people who would help them despite the risk. And he listened as the man explained in a low voice that he and his wife were Quakers, that their faith taught them slavery was evil, that they had helped fugitive slaves before, and would continue doing so despite the danger. Sarah was put to bed in a small room off the kitchen, and the Quaker woman, who introduced herself as Miriam, sat with her through the night, applying cool compresses and giving her medicine that smelled bitter but seemed to ease the fever's worst effects. Jacob and Ruth stayed in the barn as instructed, burrowed into hay and covered with blankets Miriam brought them, and Jacob could not sleep despite his exhaustion, his mind racing with the impossibility of their luck, the narrowness of their escape, the precariousness of their situation. The following day, the Quaker man, who said his name was Nathan, came to the barn and explained their situation in practical terms. The slave catchers were still in the area, searching farms and questioning residents, and it was too dangerous to move immediately. Sarah needed at least a week to recover before she could travel, and even then the route north would be carefully monitored for some time as the search for them continued. Nathan said he would hide them until the immediate danger passed, would provide food and shelter, but that ultimately they would need to make their way to Pennsylvania on their own, because while he could offer temporary refuge, he could not risk the level of involvement that active transport would require. Jacob accepted these terms gratefully, understanding that Nathan and Miriam were already taking enormous risks, that discovery would result in heavy fines and possible imprisonment, that their assistance was a gift he had no right to expect. He spent the next week hidden in the barn during daylight hours, only emerging after dark to check on Sarah, working through his jumbled thoughts about faith and goodness and the strange fact that the people helping them were white, while the people hunting them were also white, and how race alone did not determine a person's moral character, even though the system of slavery tried to create that binary. Sarah recovered slowly, the fever breaking and her appetite returning. and Miriam taught Ruth things about healing and medicine that might prove useful, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Quaker women. Jacob felt his estimation of these strangers grow with each passing day, moved by their quiet competence and undemonstrative kindness, by the way they treated him and Ruth as human beings rather than property, by their insistence that all people were equal in the sight of God and deserving of freedom and dignity. When Sarah was well enough to travel, Nathan gave them detailed directions to the next safe house, a farm in southern Pennsylvania run by a black family who had bought their freedom and now helped others reach safety. He provided supplies and a small amount of money, and he drew them a map showing roads to avoid and landmarks to watch for, and he told them that the journey would be dangerous, but that if they were careful and lucky, they could make it. Miriam pressed food into their hands and spare clothes for Sarah, and she told them she would pray for their safety, and Jacob thanked them both with words that felt inadequate to express what their help had meant. They left Nathan and Miriam's farm on a moonless night 2 weeks after arriving, Sarah riding on Jacob's shoulders, Ruth carrying their supplies, both adults moving with renewed purpose after their rest and recovery. They traveled north through Virginia toward Maryland and then Pennsylvania, following Nathan's map, avoiding the main roads, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings, slowly putting distance between themselves and the Marlowe plantation. The journey took another 3 weeks, 3 weeks of constant vigilance and gnawing hunger and the perpetual fear of discovery, but they kept moving because stopping meant capture and capture meant returning to bondage. They crossed into Pennsylvania in early June, and Jacob felt something shift in his chest when Nathan's directions indicated they had left Virginia behind, even though he knew that crossing a border did not guarantee safety. That fugitive slave laws meant they could still be captured and returned. But it was a milestone nonetheless, a recognition that they had come hundreds of miles, that they had survived pursuit and sickness and exhaustion, that they were closer to real freedom than they had ever been. The safe house in southern Pennsylvania was exactly where Nathan said it would be, a small farm run by a man named Frederick and his wife Cassandra, who welcomed them with food and information about the next leg of the journey. Frederick had been enslaved in Maryland until he purchased his freedom 15 years earlier, and he understood intimately what Jacob and Ruth had experienced, the fear and determination that drove people to risk everything for freedom. He told them they could stay for a few days to rest and resupply, but that they should ultimately make their way to Philadelphia, where a larger black community existed, and where they could more easily disappear among the free population. Jacob and Ruth stayed with Frederick and Cassandra for 5 days, recovering their strength, letting Sarah play like a normal child for the first time in her life, and Jacob found himself struggling to process what had happened, the fact that they had actually escaped, that they were living in a place where no one legally owned them, even if the threat of recapture remained. Frederick told him about the process of building a life as a free person, about finding work and housing, about the necessary vigilance because slave catchers operated even in free states, about the importance of community and mutual protection among black people navigating a world that was hostile to their freedom. When they left Frederick's farm, Jacob carried with him not just supplies and directions, but also hope, a fragile but growing sense that maybe they could actually build the life he had dreamed about, that Sarah could grow up free, that he and Ruth could work for themselves and own the fruit of their labor. They made their way to Philadelphia, a journey of several days that felt almost easy after everything they had endured, and when they reached the city, Jacob was overwhelmed by its size and noise and the sheer number of people, more human beings in one place than he had ever imagined existed. Frederick had given them the name of a boarding house run by a woman named Harriet who provided temporary shelter to fugitive slaves, and they found the place in a neighborhood that was predominantly black, streets full of free people of all shades going about their business with a freedom of movement that still startled Jacob. Harriet welcomed them cautiously, needing to verify they were truly fugitives rather than slave catchers posing as such. But once satisfied, she provided them a small room and connected them with people who could help them find work and establish themselves in the city. The transition from enslaved to free was harder than Jacob had anticipated, because while he now owned his time, he also had to figure out how to survive in an economy that ran on cash rather than forced labor. Had to learn to navigate a city whose rules and customs were completely foreign to someone who had spent his entire life on a Virginia plantation. He found work as a laborer, doing the kind of heavy physical work he had always done but now receiving wages for it, actual money that he could spend as he chose. Ruth found work as a domestic servant, her skills at cooking and cleaning transferring easily to paid employment. And together they scraped together enough to rent a tiny room in a crowded building where other fugitive slaves and free black families lived in uneasy proximity. Sarah started attending a school for black children run by a Quaker organization, and watching his daughter learn to read and write and calculate brought Jacob a satisfaction so profound it sometimes moved him to tears. This was what he had burned the tobacco barns for. This was what he had risked everything to achieve, not just physical freedom, but the possibility of education and advancement, the chance for Sarah to become something more than property, to own her own future in ways that had been impossible in Virginia. Years passed in Philadelphia, and Jacob built a life that would have been unimaginable during his time on the Marlowe plantation. He and Ruth had 2 more children, both born free in Pennsylvania, both carrying birth certificates that proved their status in a way Sarah never could. Jacob worked steadily, saving money, eventually opening a small carpentry shop where he crafted furniture and did repairs, building a modest business that provided enough income to move his family to a better neighborhood, to ensure his children had shoes and adequate food and the education that he had been denied. He never forgot Virginia. Never forgot the tobacco barns burning red against the black sky. Never forgot his mother's sacrifice or the enslaved people still trapped on plantations throughout the South. He became active in the abolition movement, attending meetings, contributing what little money he could spare, telling his story to rooms full of white Northerners who needed to understand the reality of slavery beyond abstract arguments about states' rights and property. Some people knew him as Jacob Harris, the man who had burned the Marlowe tobacco barns, and the story had grown in the telling, becoming a legend whispered among those who believed in resistance. A reminder that the enslaved were not powerless even when the system seemed invincible. On quiet nights when the city had settled and his family slept, Jacob would sometimes stand at his window and look south toward Virginia, remembering the weight of chains he no longer wore, the taste of fear that had been his constant companion, the burning rage that had driven him to strike back in the only way he knew how. He thought about Master Cornelius Marlowe, wondered if the man still owned enslaved people, still walked his fields calculating profit and loss in human flesh. He thought about the other people he had known on the plantation, wondering who had survived and who had been sold away, who had escaped and who had died in bondage. And he thought about fire, about how sometimes destruction was necessary to create space for something new to grow, about how his act of burning those barns had been both futile and essential, accomplishing nothing practical in terms of ending slavery, but proving that even the most powerless person could refuse to accept their condition passively. The tobacco barns were rebuilt within a year, the economic damage absorbed by the Marlowes and their creditors, the system of slavery continuing unchanged by one enslaved man's gesture of defiance. But Jacob had changed, had transformed himself from someone who accepted bondage to someone who rejected it, and that transformation had ultimately led him here, to freedom, to a life he had built with his own hands. Jacob Harris lived to see his children grow into adulthood, lived to see his grandchildren born free in a world that was slowly, painfully changing. He died in 1859 at the age of 57, 2 years before the Civil War would begin the process of destroying the institution that had defined his early life. Ruth outlived him by 11 years, living long enough to see slavery finally abolished, though she never returned to Virginia, never visited the place where she had been enslaved, preferring to keep her memories at a distance. Sarah became a teacher, educating black children in Philadelphia, passing on the knowledge that her father had fought so desperately to secure for her. She told her own children about their grandfather, about the night he burned the tobacco barns and set in motion the chain of events that led to their freedom, about the red glow visible for miles around that announced to the enslaved and the enslavers alike that some people would rather burn down the world than accept their bondage within it. The story of Jacob Harris, the slave who lit the tobacco barns and left the fields glowing red for miles around, became part of the oral history of resistance. Told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the essential truth that even in the depths of oppression, people found ways to strike back, to assert their humanity, to refuse the roles that slavery demanded they play. The fires burned for a single night in 1822, but the memory of those fires burned much longer. Carried forward by people who understood that freedom was not granted but seized, not given but taken, not a gift but a right that had to be claimed even when the cost was terrible and the outcome uncertain.